See, we are in Psalm 93, so we'll read that here. It won't take long. It is one of the shorter psalms in the entire book of Psalms. But after we read that, we'll talk about it. But before we do any of those things, we'll pause for a moment, we'll say a prayer, and then we'll get started. So, if you would pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have. We thank you for this opportunity to study from your word. We thank you for giving to us the word that we have, the instructions, the wisdom, the example of those that have come before, Father. We are grateful for this chance to talk about it with one another, and we ask that you would bless us as we do so, that we may all better understand what you have to say, what your will for our lives is. And Father, we ask that you would give us the strength and the wisdom and the courage to carry that out and to do your will, even when it is difficult or daunting. We are grateful, Father, for all that you have done in the past and continue to do now and into the future. We are most thankful and grateful, most benefited by the gift of your Son, Jesus, and the salvation that he brought us. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. All right. Psalm 93. Yahweh reigns. With majesty he is clothed. Clothed is Yahweh. With strength he has girded himself. Yea, the world is established. It cannot be moved. Your throne is established of old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Yahweh. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. Above the voices of many waters, the mighty breakers of the sea, Yahweh on high is mighty. Your testimonies are very sure. Holiness becomes your house, O Yahweh, for length of days. That's it. 5 verses. Hopefully, simple enough, right? What is this psalm about? Praise. It's a psalm of praise to God. Yeah. I think it's fairly straightforward in that regard. There's not a lot of topic shifting around. There's not multiple ideas really being played off each other for the most part. It's a short, simple, straightforward praise to God. Yeah.
And the unchanging majesty of the Lord.
Yeah, it's about who he is and one of his, maybe 2 or 3 of his attributes at most. But yeah, it's about the majesty and glory and power of God. Yeah. His reign as sovereign over the world. All right, well, we can wrap. No, there's more to discuss. There's more to discuss than that. It's not quite that short. We can talk about the date of the psalm. I think the general rule of thumb that you can kind of follow is that as you go later into the book of Psalms, the Psalms themselves tend to be later written. Now, this is a general rule, not certainly anything hard and fast. There are plenty of exceptions to this. And there is some contention about this particular psalm in particular as regards to that. There are a lot of scholarly points that say this is later added to the collection. This is something that is used perhaps in the post-exile to celebrate the return of Judah and the nation of Israel to greater size and power, right? The restoration afterwards. However, there's very little specifically referred to within the Psalms, of course, very short, to give us any sort of historical event. There's nothing mentioned for us to hook onto. As well, there's a Greek version that is not generally used in terms of the fact that it has a superscription, a thing above the psalm. As you see, some of them do. Actually, as I look down, none of the other ones on the page except Psalm 98 here have one. But if I flip back, Psalm 90, for example, has the superscription telling us that it is a psalm of Moses. There's one in Greek version of the Psalms, not every one, but one of them, that refers to this as a song of David. And again, we've talked about how that doesn't necessarily have to mean David wrote it, though that is the traditional understanding, because it could easily mean that it is a style, kind of in the manner of David. But as well, an early date does tend to fit with this one for other reasons, inferred kinds of things, or things that are maybe implied by the psalm itself. The internal textual information. The style, and this is beyond my knowledge, but talking about the words chosen, the way that the verbs are used, I got a little ways into reading the argument about that, and I thought, I don't know that I could follow this argument if it was about the English language and the use of verbs, so I'm going to leave that be. But there are people that make an argument that say that if you look at the verbs and the way that they're used in this psalm, and that poetic form is more closely associated with early psalms, psalms that are known to be written much earlier rather than the later ones. So it's kind of a linguistic style. As well, and this is a little bit more obvious to someone like us, a lot of these verses follow a pattern of having 3 lines rather than a pair, which is apparently much more common in earlier psalms and earlier poetic works rather than the later ones. So there's a few things about this that hint that this could be an earlier psalm, but there is, as I say, very little definitive or absolute to give us a date. And there are people who make arguments in both directions. There's some other things as well. God's reigns, the topic from the other one, and also, and this is an important one to mention because it comes up, we'll talk about this more, the use and emphasis on the holy name of God as well is much more common to earlier psalms than later ones. The use of the term Yahweh as opposed to, I believe, the term that you see of Adonai coming in the later ones. So the shift in the way that God is referred to is something that is typical of the early psalms. And this one does heavily emphasize the name Yahweh. So this psalm may be placed here, despite it being an earlier psalm, because its theme is consistent with a lot of the other work in Book 4. The psalms that are grouped together here, particularly the ones that are coming out from Psalm 95, I believe, through about 98, maybe even 99. I have to go double check. These are psalms that have an emphasis on God's power and reign as sovereign. And so thematically, even as an earlier psalm, someone may have thought it was more appropriate to put it here because it fit with the kind of topics. You can often see that in our own songbooks, that we'll put songs together, group them thematically, even if they are very different in style, very different in date, very different in length, all kinds of things. That is actually something that is done. So these are sometimes referred to as enthronement psalms, and I bring this up less because this is an important thing for us to understand and believe, then I think this is actually something that is probably not correct. There is what should I put in here about this? Yeah, there's a scholar, I forget his name, who proposed that this is actually a psalm that is used during a ritual enacted during a festival that kind of figuratively, that's the wrong word, it uses a thing done during worship at the temple to enthrone God or to place him, maybe in the figure of the ark, on an elevated place or enthrone him. I tend to think that that's probably not true. There were arguments back and forth in this, and some different things I read. There's really very little in the Bible to support this, particularly as this would seem to be a significant or an important kind of thing to do if this was something that was one of the described festivals or rituals. It's not. This is something that he is inferring from the nature of these psalms themselves. The idea that saying Yahweh reigns implies that they are going to do this. This is, again, kind of related to those verbs that get a little complicated. Because the verb can either mean Yahweh is reigned, we are putting him in his beginning, or that he has always been, right? It is an infinitive. So the way that you feel about this probably has to do with how much you think the kind of Hebrew religious practice in society was influenced by the societies around them. This was something that they know was done in some of the pagan societies in that same area with gods such as the Baals, that they would actually have a ritual where their idol would be placed into a throne and they would celebrate, in a sense, his ascension to supreme godship. For all those reasons, I think this is probably not likely. But that is the reason you'll sometimes hear psalms like this referred to as an enthronement psalm, when really it's, I would say, more about just the fact that God is sovereign and reigns over the universe. Anyways, talking about reigning, why use that phrase, Yahweh reigns, to begin the psalm? These are the first two words of the psalm. I believe it's actually even given its own line before coming on to the next one. All right, fair enough. It's a sort of thesis statement, I would say. And again, that's probably using a modern term and stretching it practically to the breaking point. But this is the primary idea of this psalm. The idea that God, not just any God, but the God of Israel, Yahweh God, is the reigning and supreme Lord of the world. And this is emphasized by putting his name, his very name, as the very first word, and emphasizing it again, by setting it apart right at the very beginning. That this is the primary idea, almost as if to say, if you take nothing else away from what else is about to follow, remember this part. Right? This is the key. This is the important part of what we're going to do. We're going to elaborate on it as the psalm goes on, but don't forget, right? Yahweh reigns. Yahweh is the reigning deity. Bottom line, right? What is it that my boy says about period? He has a phrase, a set of phrases. How does that go? You remember? No?
Conversation.
Yeah. He emphasizes that he's being emphatic. Period, end of conversation. He has several more that he's tacked on since then. Anyways, but the point of what I'm trying to make with the example I have remembered here at the spur of the moment is that this is the main point of the author of the psalm. That God's sovereignty over the universe. It is also an eschatological statement, even given as an expression of the present tense, right? Which is what they're this is said in, or perhaps the infinitive. This is the verb argument, right? An eschatological statement is talking about the end of time. That this is going to be how things are through the ages and on into eternity. As the world comes to a close, this statement will still be true, and it will continue on forever. So it is not merely, this is what it is right now, here's how things stand as we speak, but this is a statement about how things are going to be, right? And again, putting it at the front and using again, the infinitive verb to describe this, saying Yahweh reigns, is a way of talking about the end times also. Because this is one of the ultimate ideas of the understanding of the Old Testament prophecies. Right? The coming of the Messiah. That eventually, Messiah would come, and a kingdom would be established, it would not be overthrown, and it would endure throughout the rest of time and on into eternity. Now, again, when we see Jesus coming in the Gospels, how that was going to be accomplished was misunderstood by a lot of people who studied the Old Testament. Right? The idea of a temporal kingdom versus a spiritual kingdom. But this serves as that same kind of statement in order to drive that point home. Making this, again, fun word to say, eschatological statement. And as I mentioned in the introduction, why this psalm might be here, when we're talking about the date, this is not the only one, right? Several psalms in book 4, this one included in this particular section in the 90s, look ahead to the end of time and talk about the reign of God. The word used for majesty in verse 1, talking about how God is clothed, is also the same word used for the swelling rise of the sea, which is an interesting turn of phrase, particularly in light of some of the other things we'll notice as we go along and talk about the ocean. If we get so far in verse 4, the swelling rise of the ocean is the same word for the majesty of God, or the majesty that is being used here. why would you use the same word for these two things? What is that saying about God that that word means majesty? Yeah.
If you've ever seen large waves, it's a majestic sight.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an impressive and majestic sight to watch a large wave. Yeah. What else do waves have as an attribute that is, they're not just impressive to look at,
They're powerful.
they're extremely powerful. Yeah. Yeah. It's like the old story of King Canute, right? Everybody knows the story about King Canute when he was flattered too much by his advisors, talking about how he was so powerful and so important, and he ordered everybody to take his throne, carry it down to the beach. He sat there on the beach, and the waves started hitting his feet as the tide came in. And he ordered the sea to stop coming up on his feet. And of course it doesn't. And his point is that, look, you're flattering me too much. There are plenty of things that are beyond my control. Right? But God, in that same comparison, right, being like the waves, is irresistible. Who stops the sea? Who holds the waves back? Right? How do you do that? You don't do that. Again, particularly in their time and place, the sea was destructive and uncontrollable. It was powerful. It was difficult to understand. They didn't know why a lot of it worked the way it did. Right? And so the idea of God's majesty being equivalent to this creates a very good image for who God is. Particularly if, as we see later, it talks about God being in control of this. Not only is God like this in some ways, again, no analogy for God is one-to-one and perfect. They all fail at some point if you stretch them too far. But God is in control and has power over these things. He wears these. These are what are called metonymies of effect. He's wearing majesty and strength. The idea is that he has and can do the things that majesty and strength provide. He has this glory about him. He has this power. He has this ability. And by saying that he wears those things, there's another way of saying that he can do the things that those are, right? He has those attributes and abilities. A poetic form of saying he wears majesty. He's robed with it. He is girded with strength. He is therefore strong and can do things that the strong do. The implication then of the world being established, which is the final line, it says simply that the world is established and cannot be moved, is that God himself has then done so. It's not explicitly stated. If you look at the final line of verse 1 in Psalm 93, it says, the world is firmly established, it cannot be moved. It doesn't say God did that, but this is implied, particularly when we take it in context with verse 2, which follows that up, that God, in fact, has established the world and is unable to be moved. God, as the fixer of the world, the one who sets it in place, right, fixes it in place, is therefore the only one who would then be able to move it. No one else can do so. It's a way of setting him apart, talking about his power, talking about how he is greater than any of the other so-called supposed gods that the people around Israel worshipped. Right? It elevates him and who he is above them. Creation then testifies to God's place as the supreme power and only true God. Two, literally says that his throne was established from then. Right? It doesn't say long ago, it just says from then, which is where we get the idea, again, that it's referring back to the line in 1, talking about creation. God's throne has been established since the time of creation, and therefore the second line of verse 2, you are from all eternity. He has existed from time, before time, and he will continue to exist into the future. God's eternal nature is emphasized. Why would they want to emphasize God's eternal nature from time immemorial? There was something I mentioned briefly, and it's okay if you missed it, it's fine. No one's getting graded today. But I mentioned something earlier in the introduction, talking about another topic, the introduction to this psalm. Why would they want to emphasize God's eternality? That's all right. It's all right. It was quick. We were talking about the idea of the people that worship the Baals, and this psalm being an enthronement psalm, and a particular ritual that was enacted in other places in Canaan. They had a ritual where they would put their god, their idol, onto a throne. And their understanding of this is that at some point in the past, their god had risen to a place of prominence. And the contrast being drawn here, right, an implied contrast, is that knowing that these other people had this conception of their God as rising to power and becoming supreme, is that they're saying about Yahweh God, the true God, he didn't have to do that. He always was that. He started out that way. God has always been supreme in power. God has established the world from his position of power, created everything, and he continues to be supreme in power above everything and everyone, and will carry on so into the future. Hence the use of the infinitive form of the verb, saying it will go on for eternity, from before time to the past the end of time, encompassing all the times God is supreme. Therefore, elevating and saying that their God is greater, superior, better, etc., than the gods that are round about of the competing pagan nations nearby. Again, it's not explicit. They don't mention these other people. They don't mention these other gods. But the inference is certainly there for anyone who knows about that, and as you certainly would, living in that time and in that place. Why the sudden shift then? We're talking about God. We're talking about his throne being established, his power over creation. But then we begin talking about seas in verse 3. The seas have lifted up, O Lord. The seas have lifted up their voice. The seas have lifted up their pounding waves. Again, we talk about the introduction, 3 lines for the verse, which is again typical of earlier psalms, but some translations use floods. The implication is lots of water, is what the word would mean. Sometimes it meant to sea, sometimes it meant to flood. But why bring that up now?
Explained in the next verse?
Yes, the next verse has a lot to do with it. Well, yes, context, so important. Yes, very good. What does it say in verse 4? That he's mightier than these things. Yeah. We're setting up the comparison. And once again, there is an implied comparison that is being done, even though it is unstated. Because the gods of the Canaanites, the gods of the Babylonians often, worshipped what kind of God? A god of chaos. Right? Nature gods are unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. They have no weather forecasts whatsoever, and even ours that we have nowadays, they can get things wrong. Things change. We don't always understand it. It was even worse for them, because there's no way to get a message about any sort of storm that's coming. They just sort of appear out of nowhere. The sea was an embodiment of chaos, because who can understand how that works? All of a sudden you've got waves and there's no reason for them. You don't know why, they just show up. Storms appear, chaos. And this power that was embodied in this chaotic element was worshipped by a lot of the pagan peoples. And so it has, in a sense, the seas, the floods, embodying chaos, rising up, causing problems, being there, and perhaps we could even infer that it is challenging God. The seas have lifted up their voice and they're pounding waves. But it doesn't matter, Because verse 4, that's my talking about chaos and emptiness, because it is all, even though it is all these things, mighty, terrifying, dangerous, powerful, verse 3 acknowledges this, it is a setup to verse 4. God is more powerful than these things. He is in control of these things. His strength is greater than the strength of these things. That Yahweh God is the one who created these things. And therefore, he obviously has dominion over them. That this is, it follows, right? We're setting almost a logical argument in some sense. It's very poetic in its expression in the song, but that's what we're doing. That's my next note. Yeah. This is the point of the end, of the conclusion of verse 4. That more powerful than wave and weather is Yahweh. He is above it all. There are people, did I put this in a note? Yeah, well, I don't think I put this in a note, but that's okay. We'll use this one too, because there are people that speculate that this is actually a reference to the Exodus. Why would this be a reference to the Exodus?
Passing through the Red Sea.
Yes, passing through the Red Sea. Yeah. There are people that read this as a description of God's dominion and authority over the sea and the waves. And then during the Exodus, when they arrive at the Red Sea, God parts it to allow the Israelites through. And once they are through and the Egyptians begin to pass through, he closes it again to destroy their enemies. That he uses the expression of chaos as his instrument for the destruction of those that would oppose him. That the sea serves God's will, does what he bids. Other people see this as well as a reference. This one I'm less convinced of. I don't think I put a note in this. This is being representative of creation itself, of bringing order from chaos. Remember we read in the early part of Genesis, I think I did put a note on this. No. That God's spirit moved over the face of the deep. It refers to the waters there in Genesis. I'm less persuaded about that. I can go either way. I think the main point is really the key. The idea that this is an expression of elemental power, chaos itself, and God's supremacy over it. And whether you think it refers to particular events like the Exodus or creation, either way, that would merely be an example of the primary point, who God is and what God controls. This sort of then carries on and fits in with the idea of fixing Israel as his chosen people. We'll talk about that in a second. The idea of Israel being chosen is important because of who God is and who Israel is. It is not a God that they have created, right? The idea of the difficulty with idols, of course, is that you know where they come from. Right? If you're going to worship something that you've yourself created out of stone or wood or metal, you know where that came from, right? Like you made it yourself, or you got Bill, the idol maker down the street, to craft you one. And it's clearly something, an event, in a sense, over which you have control. It's a little weird and a little awkward, I would think, to worship something over which you have control. Right, that representation. But it works the other way around with God and his people. They didn't choose him. They didn't make him. God chose them. God came to them and selected them. Right? They weren't given, in a sense, an option. It's an expression of God's power and sovereignty and control that he chose Israel to be his people. Different from the other gods. Other people select their gods. Israel was selected by their God. They're different. Verse 5, look at this. I might even finish early. Yeah, you were right, Mike. What are the testimonies of God? So translations, my NIV here that's on my stand says statutes in that first line of 5, but what are these? Statutes usually means laws. The word is actually closer to testimony, though.
Covenants.
Sorry?
Covenants.
The covenants, yes. Yeah, and I think that's really what it's getting at, right? The covenants themselves. But let's elaborate, dig a little deeper. I got the time to do it today. Shocker. What's a covenant?
Binding agreement.
A binding agreement. Yeah. Yeah. I heard someone else start to say something. A promise. Yeah, exactly. An agreement and a promise. It's a thing where you have agreed together that this is going to be the way things are done, and usually both sides have obligations. And so what is this then saying about God that these things are sure or true? That he's going to follow through.
He's going to always be faithful.
Yes.
Regardless of whether we're not.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. God's faithfulness is assured regardless of our own. Right? God follows through on what he says that he will do. He keeps his promises. He does not tell lies. These are the elements or attributes of Yahweh that make him so much more dependable than any other spiritual being that might promise you something. Right? Even if we were to credit those pagan gods with some measure of reality, right? Being the earthly face of some spirit, right? Some evil spirit, they are not dependable and reliable. Even if you think they are not, even if we say that it's not, and they're simply worshiping nature itself, just random acts of nature, you can't depend on it. That's the whole point of the chaos, right? And believing that the seas embody that chaos is that you don't know what's going to happen next. You can't rely on such a deity or on such a object of your worship. And the contrast is with Yahweh, who is dependable, who is reliable, who makes promises and follows through. That you can rely on what he has said and what he has done and know what the future holds with him. But then the next half, holiness adorns your house, or is suitable for your house. What does that last line mean? How do you adorn something with holiness? Or why would something be suitable for holiness? What is holiness?
Set apart.
Set apartness, yeah. Holiness is to be holy is to be set apart. Yeah.
We're special.
Be special, yeah. I mean, it's set apart because it's special because it's set apart. It depends on what we're talking about, but yeah, they both go hand in hand. Yeah. God, Yahweh God, is sui generis. He is the only example of his type. There is no other God like him. There is no other being like him. And therefore, it is eminently suitable that God and his temple be set apart, because God is different. To set him apart, to remove him, in a sense, his dwelling from the common things of this earth, and make it sacred and holy, set apart and reserved for him, is suitable, because there is no one like God, no one with power like God, no one who does the things God does, no one who is faithful like God. And so the author of the psalm is telling us it makes perfect sense that he should have a temple, that it should be reserved for God and not for other purposes or other people, that it should be set apart from the rest of the city, that it needs to be special. It matters, it's suitable for God to have things, his house or anything else really, reserved for him because of who God is. Yeah.
I like it that God had his people establish their capital in Jerusalem, and then establish a temple in the middle of that capital, and then in the middle of that temple, a holy place, and then in the middle of the holy place, a separate holy of holies where God was.
Right.
So it's like, David couldn't imagine why he couldn't build a house for God. And God said, it's left for somebody else. Maybe he's not ready, maybe he's not holy enough, maybe he's not ready to settle there. But God left it to Solomon. And when Solomon built the temple, the Jewish people get scattered all over the world and all over, their greater kingdom, from Damascus down to Egypt. And yet they don't build new temples at strategic or important places like is common among religious people.
Right.
So the Pope builds his temple in Italy, and in Constantinople, the other Eastern Orthodox build their leader temple there. And other religions build their temples, and then they build sub-temples, and they extend it out. He never did that. He asked the people, my temple's in heaven, how can you build one for me? But be it as it may, if you want to see a temple, we'll build it here. But there's only one. It never was extended. It never was different, because it is that holy of holies of holy place.
Yeah, it's a good point. That God's temple only exists in one place. There was one temple. And even when it was torn down, right, they just rebuilt it in the same spot,
Right.
Without moving into some other location. Yeah, it's an excellent point. This singular nature of it all. Yeah. All right. God's unique nature means likewise that his house should be special. This is also sort of probably a deliberate contrast, at least again within the context of the psalm, right? The implied contrast with the temple worship that Israel does and the worship of Baals, which was much more widespread and, earthy in a lot of ways. They were very human in a lot of the things that they did. And then as well, and this is my last point, I'll just throw this out here, and there'll be time for complaints today probably. So he establishes Israel, he does the same thing with his church, right? The temple then shifts, right, from being a physical earthly place to being ourselves. We, the body of believers, each of us is a temple for the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. But God establishes his Israel and then establishes the church. That he makes the covenant promises with Israel, and there are the covenant promises with we that have followed as followers of Christ. Right? The new covenant Christ makes with the blood that he shed. And this is certainly not a prophetic psalm in that regard, but you see the parallels as it transfers forward. The idea of the same sort of concept, the same idea carrying through, because there is a singular through line to all of the Bible in this regard. That's all I got. Yes, sir.
I'm just going to say that in the Old Testament, God went to the fathers and found the leaders among people and let them hear his message and share it with the people. But he was constantly gathering all the people to himself. He didn't go to different peoples and languages and nations and become a different God. He always did that. And then when he established the nation of Israel, he told the Israelites and Jews, go out and share this message with the other peoples, proselyting or bringing them into the message. And then with Christians, he didn't say, this is a totally different. He says, every people's coming into the same church. It's all the same. It's not a different moon god or a Baal god or nature god. He's the same God for everyone. He brings everyone in. He doesn't divide himself into different manifestations of himself.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the message to Isaiah about him being the same as he always has been and always will be. I would say I don't think that the message for Israel was that they were supposed to spread the word of God around the world. Israel was very insular, and as the chosen people, they were not given evangelism as their mission whatsoever. People could become Jewish, but they were set apart as a sacred holy people in order to carry the line forward for the eventual Messiah, but they were not there to change the rest of the world in terms of who they worshipped. That was a definite shift in how that happens with the coming of Christ. It's a bit of a big topic for the last 30 seconds of my time. I didn't finish that really after all. But the shift is because of the original promise, I would say, to Abraham, right? That eventually the world will be blessed through his line, but the culmination and fulfillment of that comes with the birth of Jesus. That until then, the blessing for everyone else has not yet arrived. Everyone is eventually given access in the same way to God through the coming of Christ, but I don't know that exists at this period in history. Anyway, I'm running over. I apologize, you don't get time for complaints today. You can ask the final question or throw a final thought at me if you'd like. Yes, sir.
So David was not allowed to build the temple, probably because he was too warlike.
Because he was too
Warlike.
Yeah, he's referred to as being a man of blood. That God says that he's being a man of blood, it's going to go to his son, Solomon, the authority or the privilege of building the temple. Yeah. All right, well, everybody, be very patient with me stretching 5 verses out to the full class time today. I appreciate your time, though, and we will talk about Psalm 94 next week. Thank you.